Hi, Anthony. How's everything?
Pretty good, pretty good. I know today you're going to talk to us about, I think, adjusted GDP versus traditional GDP.
Yes. So, for those of you that follow the kind of economic covers that we put out, one of the themes that I try to bring out is that looking at overall GDP isn't necessarily the best metric for gauging freight activity in the economy. There are an awful lot of things that get captured in GDP that aren't necessarily relative to freight. So for example, like the US economy, about 2/3 of it is made up of service activity. So it's spending on healthcare, spending on financial services. Like this generates a lot of economic activity, but not necessarily a lot of freight activity. And so what I typically do with the GDP numbers when they come out is I'll take the data and I'll strip out all the things that I think are less relative to freight, and I focus just on the good side of the economy. And I think by doing that, you get a much better picture of what the freight economy is doing at any given point in time. So if you look at this chart here, I have a couple of different graphs. The green line here is traditional GDP. The white line is this goods adjusted GDP, which strips out the services and focuses on the things that generate freight. So a couple things to bring out. If you were to look at this period between late 2016 through the current period, in terms of total GDP, you're looking at a real acceleration in economic activity. Like growth was below 2% at the end of 2016, all the way up to 3.1% as of the most recent reading in the first quarter of 2019. But the goods economy really hasn't behaved that way. I mean, typically when you think about the goods economy and freight activity, the best period was the middle part of last year. And I think once you strip out these kind of components of GDP that aren't relative to freight, you start to see that a lot more clearly. So the white line here is goods adjusted GDP. You can see really at the end of 2017, you get a spike in terms of year-over-year growth on the good side of the economy, all the way through the middle part of 2018 before things start to die down. And now you're at this period here where goods activity growth is a lot slower than overall economic activity, right? And so again, the idea is just to kind of focus on the components of GDP that are more relative to freight. It'll give you a much better understanding of how the freight economy is doing.
Exactly. And so with this GDP talk, GDP comes out, I believe, Friday. Is that right?
That's right. So the second quarter, first reading for second quarter GDP comes out Friday morning.
Any expectations for where that's going to head up?
Sure. I mean, I think the overall economy is probably going to slow down. I think this 3.1% growth that you saw in the first quarter of the year is probably going to settle around 2.6, 2.5%. On the good side of the economy, I think the growth is still going to be significantly slower. Like I think it's more reasonable to expect year-over-year growth of about 1.5%, maybe below that. There's still some goods data that has to come out between now and Friday that'll give me a better picture of where it'll settle. But I would expect that it's going to start to look very similar to what we saw in 2016. You can see the readings in 2016 were about 1.5%, slightly higher than 1.5% through most of this freight recession. I think the numbers when they come out on Friday are going to look very similar to that. Like you'll start to see things below 2%, around 1.5%, or possibly even lower than that.
Wow. All right. So, but definitely a more enhanced way of looking at the GDP, and something that we now have active in our Sonar platform.